Hi, everyone. We're going to get started on this next session. So if everyone can take a seat or stand on the side, however you're comfortable. All right. Yate, for those who don't know me, she'e Farina King Yenishye, Bilagana Nishle, Do Kia Ani Bashushin, Bilagana Dashache, Do Sinajani Dashonale, Akot Ego Atsat Nishle. I am Farina King, and I'm an associate professor of history and an affiliate of Cherokee and Indigenous studies at Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, homelands of Cherokee Nation and United Kituwa Band of Cherokees in Oklahoma. I received my PhD in history studying with Don Fixico. He was a great mentor, so I had to do a shout out to him, and worked with great folks there at Arizona State University. And I've been able to be a traveler in many different places in Dine Bazad, Navajo language. I learned it's important to say traditionally that wherever your umbilical cords is where you're from. That was a way of saying where are you from, is where your nits'eh, where your umbilical cord's buried. And that really, actually I had a great experience talking about that in Tonanez Dize, where I was born in Tuba City, Navajo Nation. And I think one time I was there at a chapter meeting at Tonanez Dize, and the folks came up to me and said, "We know why you keep coming back, because I've lived a lot of places, I've been a wanderer, and I've been able and fortunate and very blessed to work with many different peoples from all over the world. I actually studied African history for my master's degree and was able to go to Senegal and connect with as well Yoruba peoples of Nigeria and different areas, but have lived in Vermont and Texas and Utah and different places. But folks came up to me in Tonanez Dize and they said, "We know why you keep coming back. You know, this is where nits'eh, your umbilical cords, are buried." So I am very grateful to be in a state that is homelands as well to Dene Bekeya, Navajo Nation, in what's considered to some, southeastern part of Utah. And I'm honored and very happy and grateful to have with me here two students that worked with me, have been in contact with me throughout this past school year, academic year at Northeastern State University, is Charlee. Gilliam White, recently married, and so that's where you might see White and Gilliam mixed up there, but she's Mrs. White now. And Charlee was, let me get more of her fuller background here. She is from Ho, Oklahoma, or is it pronounced How? How. Thank you, Charlee. And she attended Northeastern State University and recently finished her undergraduate degree. And Jarren did as well, who I'll also introduce you to. So congratulations to them for recently graduating. Let's give them a hand. That's a big deal. And so I was working with them as they were getting into their senior years at NSU. In the fall is when they both were in a class with me, actually in two different classes, which I'll talk about later when I talk with you about teaching and learning about railroads in Indian Territory and among the 5 tribes. Charlee majored in general studies with a minor in psychology, social sciences, and health and human performance. And Jarren Fourkiller is the other past recent graduate student that I worked with. Jarren Fourkiller is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation from Stillwell, Oklahoma. She is a member of the Nighthawk Kituwa Society. She majored in history with a minor in Cherokee cultural studies. And she recently completed her bachelor's degree, as I shared, and plans to use her studies to educate youth in rural communities. So I know she was in some Cherokee classes recently and had a really great different courses in our Cherokee Studies program at NSU. Unfortunately, James Singer, who was supposed to chair today, is unable to join us, but he has been great working with me and folks on the steering committee for this second gathering of railroads in Native America. So we wish him well and a speedy recovery. You know, wish you all to take care, and it's great that we are able to gather when we can, and that this is being recorded, live streamed, and a resource for those who cannot be with us in person. So thank you all for joining us from wherever you're coming from and wherever you are. Nathaniel Cummings-Lambert could also not make it in person, but we are going to actually start off with a pre-recorded video of his presentation, so we're glad that could be worked out. And then we'll be hearing from Jarren, Charlee, and me, and have time for conversation and questions, responses, comments with each other before we conclude this session. And Nathaniel Cummings-Lambert, he is a PhD student in the anthropology department and cultural and media certificate program at New York University. He holds a BA in religious studies from the New School for Liberal Arts and an MFA in art from the California Institute of the Arts. He is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians located in Cherokee, North Carolina. His research focuses on ethnographic film and contemporary Indigenous film and video practices, as well as the development of tourism, cultural heritage sites, and the local economy in Cherokee, North Carolina, and the greater Western North Carolina region. So I hope to eventually meet Nathaniel because it was interesting. I was on the program committee, as co-chair with Dr. Alessandra Link, and it was just coincidence that Nathaniel submitted his presentation, and it really fit well with this session of our focus on railroads in Indian Territory and the impacts on the 5 tribes, including Cherokees. And Nathaniel's connections to Cherokees of the East, ancestral homelands, we were really interested in hearing his presentation and drawing the connections between our research and having a conversation together. So I'm glad we'll be able to hear Nathaniel's presentation now, and we'll get started with that. And I know Nathaniel's been very great at following up with us. So Nathaniel, you said you'd be joining us virtually. We hope to connect soon, and thank you for the work you're doing. And let's get started then. Thank you. Wado.
Hello, my name is Nathaniel Cummings-Lambert, and I'd like to thank the organizers of the symposium for inviting me and allowing me to pre-record my presentation since I'm unable to be there in person. I look forward to seeing the rest of the presentations online and hopefully connecting with some folks in the near future. My presentation is called The Western and Atlantic Railroad, the Cherokee Nation Removed and the Muskogee Remembered in Atlanta. Atlanta, Georgia sprang from the settlement of Terminus, named after the terminal marker at the end of the Western Atlantic Railroad. This railroad line runs directly through the center of the Cherokee Nation prior to their 1838 forced removal. While Atlanta is generally perceived as Muskogee Creek territory and is recognized in land acknowledgments by cultural and educational institutions in the Atlanta metro region, the removal of the Cherokee Nation is also essential for the construction of the railroad, which serves as the foundation for the city. In this paper, I will draw from recent critiques of land acknowledgments, highlighting their uncertain effectiveness as land acknowledgments often remain performative. That is, if institutions performing them do so without accompanying decolonial action and without understanding the physical and historical erasure of Indigenous people. Acknowledging the Muskogee Creek is critical for honoring the tribe's homelands and their shared history of forced displacement around Atlanta. However, my paper asks how land acknowledgements can also create acts of erasure by looking at the implication of the Western and Atlantic Railroad in the Cherokee removal and the intertwined history of the Muskogee and Cherokee in northern Georgia. Land acknowledgements can be seen in relation to what Robert Nichols calls recursive dispossession. This is an unforeseen consequence of Indigenous people entering into relationships with European settlers. As trade agreements and treaties were formed, Indigenous people entered into foreign property regimes that would ignore traditional ways of relating to the land. Indigenous people were forced to resolve issues in settler courts, drawing on Western frameworks. Nichols argues that dispossession, quote, refers to a process in which new proprietary relations are generated under structural conditions that demand their simultaneous negation. In effect, the dispossessed come to have something they cannot use, except by alienating it to another, end quote. In other words, Indigenous people are only recognized as having rights to their lands after they've already been dispossessed from their territories. Nichols says we can understand this process as, quote, a recursive movement of transformation, then transference, and a retroactive attribution, or a belated ascribing, end quote. Instead of this retroactive attribution with land acknowledgements, how can we instead promote and foster relationships between Indigenous people and their lands? What infrastructure like the Western Atlantic Rail sought to do is remake the land through what Kenneth Wheeler describes as, quote, reordering the landscape, deciding what places were most important and what routes people would use to travel through the Cherokee country. It was not just that Cherokees were being pushed out. Whites were altering the way the world looked in that place. The Western and Atlantic Railroad line runs from Chattanooga, Tennessee on the northwestern border of Georgia, and then south to present-day Atlanta. This path runs directly through the center of the Cherokee Nation. The site of Ross's Landing became Chattanooga in 1839. Originally a Cherokee Nation community built around a Tennessee River ferry crossing, which Cherokee Principal Chief John Ross operated between 1816 and 1826. And with thousands of Cherokees leaving from Ross's Landing during the Trail of Tears by 1838. Today, the waterfront in Chattanooga around the site of Ross's Ferry is now home to a public park named after the Cherokee settlement. There's also a public artwork created by the Cherokee artist team Gadoogie, who in 2005 created The Passage, a Trail of Tears memorial, which seeks to memorialize the site as the beginning point of the Trail of Tears for thousands of Cherokees. Sorry about that. Computer's freezing. Atlanta sprung out of the settlement of Terminus at the end of the Western Atlantic Railroad. Originally a hub where spurs would connect to other railroad projects in the state, Atlanta was not incorporated until 1843. After taking the name Terminus, it was called Marthasville and then changed its name 2 years later. The first stop of the railroad is Marietta, Georgia, directly on the edge of the Cherokee Nation, surveyed by John Coffey in 1830. The rest of the 16 stops between Marietta and Chattanooga are all within the Cherokee Nation. Plans for the Western and Atlantic Railway began as early as 1826. Well before the signing of New Echota in 1835 and the Indian Removal Act of 1830, preempting the necessity of the Cherokees' removal. The former Georgia governor and senator Wilson Lumpkin explains after the completion of the railroad that, quote, "This fine portion of state west of the Chattahoochee, generally called Cherokee, in a very special manner imperiously demanded this great highway. The whole plan of this railroad was well matured in my mind in the year of 1826, end quote. And he connects his plans for the railway to, quote, "Before I commenced my systematic plan for the removal of the Cherokee Indians from Georgia in that year of 1827, end quote. In a report penned in 1842, he more explicitly explains, quote, "I did all that could be done at the time to keep the subject of the railroad alive and prepare the public mind until the removal of the Cherokee Indians, an event I long believed should be the signal for the commencement of our great state road," end quote. The construction of the Western and Atlantic Railway line outlines the logics of elimination and processes of settler colonialism detailed by Patrick Wolfe. We can see this process within the construction timeline of the railroad by the use of slave labor in constructing it and the forced removal of the Cherokees, which was needed to complete the project. The logic of elimination explains that if land is the primary resource for settler expansion, indigenous dispossession and elimination must occur to access new territory and to create new avenues for capital flow. In Lumpkin's reflections, he does not recount the Cherokee suspicion and eventual rejection to Lumpkin's presence when his party first attempted surveying a route for the railroad in 1826. In letters that were published in the Savannah Daily Republic, Lumpkin writes, quote, "The principal rulers of the nation protest against our right against our right to make the surveys and examination requirements without the consent of the Cherokee Nation, and they have exercised all their ingenuity to place me and my government in a degraded situation of a humble petitioner to Cherokee sovereignty," end quote. Insulted by the Cherokees asserting their rights and sovereignty over his position and the state of Georgia, he proceeded cautiously and is distressed by the Cherokees' quote, "inquisitive spirit," directing his men to, quote, "answer no impertinent inquiries." Lumpkin eventually appealed to Principal Chief Hicks after relentlessly being questioned and feeling if he explained his intentions outright, he would be allowed to continue his surveying project in the Cherokee Nation. After what Lumpkin called a considerable conversation, Hicks and Lumpkin parted ways in good humor and spirits. A few days later, to Lumpkin's surprise, he received a letter from Hicks formally denying Lumpkin's party from continuing their survey through the Cherokee Nation. Paraphrasing the letter, Hicks writes, "Gentlemen, I have now the opportunity to inform you. You must have no doubt anticipated on leaving the state of Georgia that we would not approve of a canal or making of surveys for railroads. Here we are presenting our objections to the exercise of duties which you've been required to perform within our acknowledged limits, on which we enjoy our privileges under existing treaties with the United States. We do it in friendship and goodwill towards you. Nor can we refer you to communicate the object of your mission to our General Council, as we believe it would not be agreeable to them, and we speak the sentiments of our council," end quote. Ignoring the protests that Principal Chief Hicks penned, Lumpkin gave permission for Hamilton Fulton to continue surveying a route through the Cherokee Nation. Lumpkin wrote in a letter that he did not believe Fulton would be hindered by the tribe and saw Hicks's letter as politically motivated, quote, to prove to his own people his vigilance in protecting their rights, end quote. In the face of Lumpkin's assumptions, Cherokee sovereignty was again asserted as Fulton's presence was fervently protested and he was forced out of the Cherokee Nation at gunpoint. It would be another 10 years before Lumpkin would see his initial railroad conception implemented, but support for the railroads across the state had been growing. By December of 1833, the Georgia legislature chartered 3 private railroad companies: the Georgia Railroad Company, the Central Georgia Railroad Company, and the Monroe Railroad Company. All 3 began operations in 1843. In the following year, with the signing of the Treaty of New Echota in December of 1835, ceding the Cherokee Nation's lands in the Southeast and outlining policies for the tribe to move west, planning for the Western and Atlantic Railroad once again began in earnest. On December 21st, 1836, Georgia state legislature chartered a state railroad. This would become the Western and Atlantic. In May of 1837, Georgia Governor William Charlee assigned Stephen Harriman Long as the chief engineer for the project, having considerable experience surveying the path for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and writing the first American treaties on railroad construction in 1830. Long and his assistants rapidly concluded their work by November, and the terminus marker for where the rail would end was staked, marking the point where the city of Atlanta would rise. The Cherokee forced removal began in early of the next summer in 1838. While that same year, nearly 500 slave hands were excavating and building embankments for the construction of the railroad line. And that increased to almost 2,000 by 1841. At the groundbreaking ceremony on January 1st, 1838, organized by General Abbott Brisbane, he wistfully preached how the railroad would link the hardy yeomanry of the West and the ingenious and efficient businessmen of the East to the black labor of the South. The Cherokees were also on Brisbane's mind when he remarks, quote, "Where are the late proprietors of the soil upon which we now stand? Their hearthstones are still warm, and yet we are engaged in obliterating every trace of their possessions. In order to connect the growing country and economy for mutual trade, to beget social intercourse, and to foster political confidence. Here, Brisbane damning the Cherokees and evicting the tribe from their homelands shows that it's in order to foster new connections for slave labor and U.S. trade through the railroad." While I hope I've shown the tragic necessity for the removal of the Cherokee for the Western and Atlantic Railroad to be constructed, land acknowledgments around Atlanta do not draw out this history, and instead focus on boundary lines which show the area as Muskogee. While accounts of war between the two nations are easy to come by, I would like to also point out the relations of reciprocity and mutual exchange between the Muskogee and Cherokee, which are absent when discussions of land acknowledgments are framed around boundary lines imagined by settler colonial governments. I want to further emphasize the relationship between the Muskogee and Cherokee prior to settler colonialism, and which was maintained as settlers created new pressures and distorted relationships between the nations. The boundary between the nations can be seen in the crop portion of the C.C. Royce map, depicting the boundary in close proximity to the city of Atlanta. Emphasis on property, marked by the creation of maps and surveying, which preceded and followed Muskogee and Cherokee dispossession, elicits settler colonial impulses, which draw hard lines between cultures who share customs, extended kin networks, hunting grounds, and aided each other as settlers encroached on their lands and the military forces were at their backs. Brian Rindfleisch's recent book, Brothers of Kiowa Kinship, Empire and Revolution in the 18th Century Muskogee World, centers on the bonds between the Muskogee and Cherokee. He writes, quote, "Simply put, Muskogee peoples lived with the Cherokees, and Cherokees lived in Muskogee communities. As Oconostota, a beloved man of Choctaw, best described such kinship, he wrote, 'We are here mixed like brothers,' end quote. These kinship bonds led to joint communities like Kosa Watachi and Old Night Asay, which were located on the boundaries between Muskogee and Cherokee lands. Tom Hatley also adds that, quote, "Cherokees and Creeks seem to have shared lands as hunting grounds, a subtle cooperation which tended to maintain a reserve of deer for hard times. Border towns such as Istoto and Tugelo, nominally Cherokee, had long preserved kinship with the Creeks as a kind of insurance against aggression," end quote. Here we see that while the border might be stressed for settler colonial relations and are a framework for land acknowledgements, concrete boundaries were not needed between the Muskogee and Cherokee, as kin networks and shared resources maintain good relations, not predicated on exclusion. Recognizing Muskogee and Cherokee relationships in the border area that includes Atlanta is vital, because if we only acknowledge one, we erase the other, privileging a singular narrative that displaces the multifaceted and long-standing relationships that the two cultures nurtured over generations. While acknowledging territorial boundaries of contemporary Indigenous nations is paramount for Indigenous sovereignty, those boundaries are manufactured through settler colonial forces that originally bound Indigenous people to reservations and shrunk land bases. Settler nations have a vested interest in maintaining these boundaries and the narratives boundaries construct in contradistinction to Indigenous ideologies. This is not an attempt to belatedly ascribe the Cherokee Nation a larger territory opposing Muskogee claims, but to acknowledge the fluidity of traditional boundaries fostered by community and kin, disrupting deep-rooted narratives which cloud and gloss contemporary histories. The Western and Atlantic Railroad created an impetus for Atlanta's construction, but both Muskogee and Cherokee land across Georgia was needed for the foundation of the city. Thank you.
I'll let you put it where you want it. Okay. Thank you. So really fascinating research. I look forward to following up with Nathaniel more about that. All right, Jarren and Charlee. Let's see. Going to the next slide here. Jarren's presentation is titled Railroads in Indian Territory, the 5 Civilized Tribes Struggle for Control. And just a little introduction as well to Jarren and Charlee's presentations is that they were a part of classes I taught in fall 2021. And actually, this gathering inspired the way that I taught those classes. So I'll follow up with thoughts and insights about that, and we can have dialogue about it too. But I was teaching 2 upper level classes, History of the American West and Native American History. History of the American West was in person, and my Native American history course was online. So Jarren was in the History of the American West class that met in person, and Charlee was in my online class, Native American History. And these were projects that they did for that class, and they both did some of the most exemplary research, and it had a lot more to it, different parts, components, aspects of it. They also already did a presentation at Northeastern State University for our annual American Indian Symposium. We'll be celebrating the 50th year of holding that in April 2023. So please come out to that if you can, Cherokee Nation and United Kituwa Band of Cherokees. So they were invited to come to this conversation with you because of their work that they did in those classes, the research that they did. So they're sharing with you what they learned in that research and study they did for the class. I will admit they did well in the class as well overall. So Jarren, come on up. Thank you.
Hello. Tio Nagad, Jose Dawadon, Flawless Janelle. My name is Jarren Fourkiller, and I am from Stillwell, Oklahoma, but more specifically, a small rural community, mostly Cherokee, about 15 minutes outside of Stillwell. And when Dr. King had told us about the project and how she kind of wanted it centered around Native Americans and the railroad, I knew that I wanted it to be about Indian Territory, because growing up where I grew up, you saw the railroad or a train every day. Countless times have I crossed the railroad tracks to go visit my grandparents. So I knew, like, that's what I wanted it to be about. I wanted it to be about railroads in Indian Territory because it's something I've never studied before. And so here's my presentation. It's called Railroads in Indian Territory, the 5 Civilized Tribes Struggle for Control. And so I want to clarify that I call them the 5 Civilized Tribes because that's what I grew up hearing. So I just wanted to clarify that. A little background. The 5 Civilized Tribes consist of the Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes. Traditionally, these tribes are from the southeastern woodlands area of the United States. But through the Indian Removal Act of 1830, these tribes were relocated into Indian Territory, or what is now eastern Oklahoma. So as I began to do this research, I quickly came up with a thesis, or what I titled The Problem. When railroad companies began to look towards Indian Territory, they saw specifically the area where the 5 civilized tribes, where they occupied, they saw opportunity for economic growth because these tribes own their lands. Specifically, there was no Indian agent to begin with that controlled these lands. So they saw it as an opportunity. We're going to go in and we're going to see what we can do with these lands. But the 5 civilized tribes also saw an opportunity for economic growth. And they began to negotiate with railroad companies and various entities of the U.S. government for little to no control over the railways on their lands. like I said, the 5 civilized tribes saw economic opportunities, and the Cherokee and Choctaw legislatures made plans to invest and buy stocks in the railroad companies in exchange for positions on their board of directors. Several treaties were made with the 5 civilized tribes in 1866 that would allow the railroads to enter Indian Territory. Tribal delegates and their attorneys from the 5 civilized tribes submitted preliminary drafts that included several stipulations. A couple of them included granting large land grants to the railroad companies and allowing the sale of Indian lands and using the profits to buy stock in the railroads. The 1866 treaties are very important when talking about railroads in Indian Territory. First and foremost, they allowed the railroad to enter Indian Territory. It was also during this time where the motives of the railroads and the U.S. government separated from the motives of the 5 civilized tribes. The Cherokee Treaty of 1866 states that the tribal nation whose land the railroad intends to build on must give consent. However, the treaties also stated that Congress had the overall decision. In July of 1866, Congress granted construction privileges to the Southern Branch Union Pacific Road, the Atlantic and Pacific Road, and the Kansas and Neosho Road. But the 1866 treaties with the 5 civilized tribes also punished them for their allegiance to the Confederacy during the Civil War. The same treaties that allowed railroads to enter Indian Territory also ceded portions of the 5 civilized tribes' land and had stipulations that would later allow for allotment and increase federal control over tribal lands. The first railroad to enter Indian Territory was the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, or the MKNT, whose locomotive first entered Indian Territory in June 1870. The railroads that followed is the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, the Southern Branch Union Pacific Railroad, and the Kansas and Neosho Railroad. This picture is actually about 5 minutes from my home. This is the Kansas City Southern Railroad in Bunch, Oklahoma. And here's a map showing just some of the railways that were in Indian Territory by June of 1903. Several tribes attempted to negotiate with the railroad companies in exchange for control. However, after several years of negotiations, the railroad companies did not accept any offers made by the 5 civilized tribes. And in tribal areas where the government had granted the railroads easements, Congress did not deem it important to involve any of the governments of the 5 civilized tribes. There's a quote I included because to me it said how the government and the railroads felt about how important Indian land was. And C.J. Hillier, an attorney for the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, stated that commerce created from the railroads were needed and that it was the obligation of the federal government to support national railroad growth, and those needs should outweigh any treaty obligations. The 5 civilized tribes argued that it was one thing to let the railroads have a limited right-of-way, but another thing entirely to deal with companies that had a history of violating tribal land rights. The Cherokees wrote that the railroad companies were dependent upon bad faith on the part of the government toward us. After the passage of the Dawes Act, the U.S. government allotted land to the male citizens of the 5 tribes. According to the Department of Interior's regulations concerning right-of-way for railway lines through Indian lands, the railroad companies had to go through the United States Indian agents when trying to obtain land that was already allotted. The allottee also had a right to petition the sale of their allotted lands. However, a referee was appointed to appraise the land, and they pretty much said, okay, we'll give you this much for it, but if you don't take the money, we're going to take it anyway. The court would then seize their lands and proceed with construction of the railroad. The Chickasaws claimed that the money being used to help the railroads is the very money that was from the sale of their ancestral homelands in the Southeast, and it was being used to aid in the railroad companies who sought to remove them from their lands in the West. So, just a conclusion. The 5 civilized tribes all had dealings with the railroads, and each tribe saw the railroad as an opportunity to use them to help their tribes gain economic independence. However, the 5 civilized tribes were continuously blocked from making any progress, and their land rights were constantly under attack. Legislation that was made for the 5 tribes was also turned against them. The U.S. government, more often than not, ruled in favor of the railroads, and in the end, the railroads proved to be more trouble than they were worth. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Charlee. So it's Charlee White, like I said, impact of the Oklahoma, Choctaw, and Gulf Railroad on Choctaw and Seminole land.
Okay, like Dr. King just introduced me, I'm Charlee White. During her class was one of the times that I actually got to dig a little bit deeper into Native American history. You get your public school education and you kind of get a one-sided story to it all. So it was really interesting to just learn a little bit more. And I picked the Oklahoma, Choctaw, and Gulf Railroad for my research because it was one that was close to our house that we live in, our town of Howe. So we're going to look at the evolution of the railroad, and this is a time frame that I kind of zoned in on. So it's at the end of the 19th century, and this was the beginning. So we have the Choctaw Coal and Choctaw Railroad. We go into 1894 and ownership changes. The ownership changes and the name changes with Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf Railroad. And in the first stretch of this railroad, it was in 1895 where they started it from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma to McAllister, Oklahoma. And the main goal was to move coal. We go into 1899 and Congress formally establishes it. And you see where it has the Oklahoma City to McAllister as the points. And in 1907 is where we kind of end it. Oklahoma, is on the brink of becoming a state. And as we have seen before, the railroads grew tremendously, and so did this one. So this time period happens right after the Civil War, and the railroad was placed in an area where the 5 civilized tribes were located, relocated to be stated. And this is why McAllister is kind of an important area. This is one of the many areas where these tribes were relocated from their homes. So the Choctaws, whenever I was doing research, it was a little bit hard. It was hard to find information about the tribes that were close to us. It's a smaller town where we're from. There's not a lot of just information, I guess, where you can find it. But I did find that the Choctaws did pass a bill, and that bill number was 23. It stated that it was one of the strongest statements made against the railroads at the time. And so this bill actually stated, or it created a general council for the Choctaw Nation. Before then, I guess there wasn't a council. I'm not really sure. It's just stated that it did create one. And in this council and in this bill, they did state that they would have to be any person or persons who wanted to use this land or the resources or go through it would have to be granted a charter. So that way they could have a little bit more control, the Choctaw tribe, over how their land was used, what kind of resources were used from their land, and to get to know who was actually using the land and why. If the rules were not followed, so if you weren't granted a charter and you still decided to use the land, you could be fined anywhere from $1,500 to $20,000. And I looked back a little bit because I thought it was kind of interesting. And in 1980, so we look at 1980 as the year, $1,500 would actually be closer to $7,200, and then at the higher scale of $20,000 would be roughly $72,000. So that's a lot of money, and to think about that price tag and how these bills and the acts that were passed weren't respected is really, really surprising. So this is also the time in Oklahoma where it's right after the land rush. And with the Dawes Act, you have the allotments of land. So the land's getting smaller and smaller. So in effort, there was the Five Tribes Act that was passed by Congress, and it states that the tribal existence and present tribal governments of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tribes or nations are hereby continued in full force and effect for all purpose authorized by law. This is really important because it is stating that they want autonomy. They want to be able to self-govern their people. They want to remain as one. They don't necessarily want to conform to how the U.S. government wanted them to. And Choctaw and Seminole tribes, that's their goal. They wanted to hold the autonomy. Looking at the Seminole tribes, their stand, there wasn't enough for me to put in here from my own research, but in everything I read, they did not necessarily welcome the railroads with open arms, and especially during this time. So we look at the land in Oklahoma, and the COG Railroad is one of the 14 railroads now crossing the state. And because of this, and because of the historical moments that happened during this period, there are smaller allotments of land for Native Americans. And in this land where the 14 railroads did cross, there are large businesses, tribal governments, and the federal government all going through this. And this is a short amount of time, and it's a big change. So the railroads are there, and the Native Americans are in smaller land area or acreages, I would say. So you look at, well, what's one way we can make this okay? Well, they would try to sell the land beside the railroad lines. And it was a little hard for me to understand at first, why the Native Americans would decide to do that after everything that had been done to them. But then you look at it from the other side, and you can see it as an opportunity of wealth. There was a lot of poverty during this era. There was a lot of new changes in how the economy was run. So it was an easy way for the government to get the land besides the railroads for them to use. And because of this change, the land, history, and culture was changing rapidly. And the railroad grew bigger than anticipated. So in this time, it went from the small Choctaw Coal and Choctaw Railroad to the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf Railroad, to selling land beside the railroad. And the Choctaws and Seminoles were left with a lot of dissatisfaction. Their home was changed. The dynamic of their culture and their traditions were changed. And it wasn't something that was going to go away. And through the research, it was something hard to stomach because hindsight is always 20/20. And there was a lot of new things that I've learned, especially around our area and how the geography looks now. So, thank you.
So I always say, yeah, show your sources, the different sources they use. It's wonderful. And then here's Charlee's contact. Thanks for sharing that, Charlee, if folks have questions or want to follow up with her. All right, so I'm going to see if I can actually show mine through another program here, because it's kind of fun. And I added a few more. All right, so good. You all can see that? Okay. And then you're watching my time. Okay. I'm one of those people who can forget time quite easily. I really appreciate Yvette talking about we don't really talk at the point. I think I was kind of raised, even like both my parents talked very contextualizing in all those different aspects too. So this is that same map that I think Jarren also showed from 1904, giving you a sense of just, it's carved up Indian territory. And this is technically what people would imagine is in now considered the state of Oklahoma, but the lands promised to the 5 tribes through trails of tears and under much duress and violence. And also keep in mind that these lands promised to them were also stolen and taken under violence of Osage people and indigenous peoples that were in those homelands since time immemorial. So layer upon layer of removals, onslaught, and series, as we heard from Nathaniel as well. What's really shocking to me is just again seeing over and over again the waves crashing, and they keep coming back and back. And how I hope, we talk about the past to learn and to move forward. So we're still saying that now, we still have much to learn and move forward and heal and stop violence, this violence and suffering and hurt. I want to share with you all a little of my positionality, my background, because I think this is important for however we're all entering these conversations. Where are we coming from and why are we talking about it and studying it? Nathaniel shared in his bio, that he's of the Eastern Band of Cherokees. Jarren is from Stillwell and Charlee's from Howe. And they thought about their own spaces that they grew up in, they were immersed in. For me, these are actually 2 people very important to me. I wouldn't exist if it were not for them. My Nollies, Shanali Hastin do Shanali Atza, my paternal grandparents, my grandfather and grandmother, Red Smith and Johanna Haskoutsi. And I actually don't have direct memories of them since they both passed away due to cancer. And they lived around not far from where uranium mining started, and one of the most horrific uranium mill spills in American history that hardly anyone knows about comparatively. The Church Rock uranium mill spill was down the road, but that was even just the beginning. Most people don't even know about all the kinds of mining that was happening in the lands that my father was born in and my relatives have been raised in and lived. But these are my Nollies, and they are healers. And it's interesting because that name, Smith, that was my maiden name. I'm now King, married. And Smith, I hear the story of how did we become Smiths? Are we related to any Smiths? And I actually study a lot about Indian boarding schools. That's mostly what I write about and have written a couple books, co-authored one with James Swenson and Mike Taylor recently, Returning Home, about Intermountain Indian School, and one, The Earth Memory Compass. But in stories about boarding schools, people learn of forced renaming, naming there, of assuming and imposing names, Eurocentric names, Euro-American names on indigenous peoples, or even numbering. of just a lot of dehumanization there. The interesting story of my grandfather is he received his name basically from the railroad, working with the railroad. And these were stories that I grew up with and learned, that we're called Smith because my grandfather worked for the railroad, and they said, "What's your name?" You know, he was getting that wage-paying job, and they couldn't pronounce, you know, Navajo names. There's also a different sense of Navajo naming that doesn't align the same with Euro-American naming. There are sacred names that you don't use and like every day with everyone. They're kind of like more nicknames. Like my father was called Ashkiyaje, little boy, and that's what, you know, he was more generally called among the family. So they said, okay, we're going to call you Red Smith. And then that's how he became Red Smith, and we became the Smiths with my father and the railroad. My grandfather, Shanali Hastin. But he was a hatafle, a healer. Some would say the term medicine man, you know. And what was interesting to me was it seemed to me like this didn't make sense. I was like, how could my grandfather be a traditional healer who didn't speak English? Like, these are the stories I heard about him, that he didn't speak English, he wasn't practicing Judeo-Christianity, he lived by the ceremonies and ancestral ways of Dine. And how could he work for the railroad? And he worked very hard for the railroad, was the understanding of the stories with my dad. And my dad would say it really enabled actually a lot of mobility, that his father traveled a lot and would go to different places actually to find plants and herbs. And I think he took advantage of the railroad in that way too while he worked for it. And my father did as well, that because his father worked for the railroad, he was able to catch rides and go to different places. And he'd talk about going to Alcatraz when there was the occupation of Alcatraz, and he rode the train there, and different memories of places where my father, who a Philip Smith Wolye, do Shema a Joanne Smith Wolye, for those who might know them and my relations. And so then I started to connect more of these dots too, is that when I was young, visiting my family who live around what we call the checkerboard area. And why is it called the checkerboard area of Dene Bikeya, of our ancestral Dene homelands, is a lot to do, again, with the railroad and the trains and these different dynamics. And my family is from Seyanichi, Rehoboth area. And whenever I'd go visit or spend the night, I'd be woken up, just how Larry described it too, staying here. The railroad, the trains would wake me up, and I'd hear them all the time. And even I was with my family trying to help with different needs or questions that they had about their home sites and places. I looked into things and was told, those houses are too close to the train. It's a health impediment. It's going to be deafening because of how close our relatives live to the trains, next to the trains and these rails. So I'm sharing these stories because this, being a part of this gathering, was an impetus for me, and it's really an opening for me to continue to understand my family stories. These are stories of shik'eh, my kinship stories of who I am. Even if I'm learning constantly who I am. It's fascinating to see that also shared by Charlee and Jarren, saying they saw this, it's right there, we're swimming in it. And that's what I try to teach always with our students and people I interact with, is history surrounding us. The truth is right in front of you. It's just we have to learn how to put on the lens and to understand how to see it and what we're seeing and how it's been shaping us all along, whether you're conscious of it or not. And how do you have that awareness and understanding and constant learning, because it is a constant learning journey. So I'm grateful for this gathering because as I've been living in Charlee, Cherokee Nation country, and United Kituwa Band country, and again, as I mentioned, layers of history, layers of impressions of different peoples and convergences of peoples and beings that shape that space. I wanted to work with students to recognize how railroads affected the areas that we live and breathe in and walk in, and that is understanding indigeneity. Indigenous is that land is you. You are inseparable from it. It shapes you, and you have that understanding and knowledge of it. So these were some of the aspects, and I was able to thank Amanda Francom, Northwestern Band of Shoshone, who was the main artist, and I'm excited we'll get to hear from her. So I thank you all for staying, through these sessions. It can be hard and tiring with a lot of listening, but we're excited for everyone who's participating, especially Amanda's work, that I was able to show my students and share it with them. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I was teaching 2 classes, History of the American West and Native American History. And in the History of the American West class, I assigned Empire's Tracks, that I know the first gathering had Dr. Karuka come speak, and Elena Roberts. I've been here all the while. And in the online class, I kind of catered the project. Both had a major research project, to say that first off, that had different steps to it. It was a process. So I want to share this with you all because this session, a big theme of it is when we don't know something or we don't recognize it, especially with railroads. Like I said, I wrote books about boarding schools and different things, but there are a lot of these inseparable connections and linkages. And so how can we learn and continue to make those connections that are needed to have the fuller sense of really what has happened and what is shaping us, right? That awareness and recognition. So with this experience I'm sharing with you, with the classes and giving some more context to Jarren and Charlee's work in particular, was in the Native American History online class. The theme was Native American Histories of Movement, Technology, and Railroads. So we've heard these different buzzwords in folks' presentations, especially mobility, as I mentioned, the stories of my family that made traveling and learning journeys. And with the major research projects that they did, they had to do an outline and a works cited. So we always say, as historians, we're pushed to think about what are your sources? What are you learning from? And I think especially in this gathering and symposium is, I hope we keep pushing ourselves to look to sources that are not the low-hanging fruit all the time with whatever your positionality is, but then also being ready to learn how to connect with different sources, because I'm also constantly learning how to be humble and to be put in my place, to be honest. And that's not in a derogatory term. I think it's also protocol of there's certain knowledge that I'm not ready for as well. So balancing that as well of there's certain things that Indigenous communities, they want anyone to know, as we've also brought up issues of representation, misrepresentation, and just outright lack of representation and invisibility. So that's something to also consider, but there are always Indigenous voices and perspectives that want to be heard and that should be heard. So that's something I'll say that I tried to emphasize with my teaching, and I hope people, whoever you interact with, you also consider that. And then they had an exercise of making a short video of introducing a primary source, because I try to have them think about, okay, if we're turning to the past and thinking about history, what is that main source, but not just that it's a source you're, primarily focusing on, but it gives you an actual window to the past, and you were, that person was there, or it's that more direct link. And then they had a first draft, peer review, meetings with me, where I tried to really mentor them and have direct conversations with them, final draft, presentations, making poster designs. And we also connected this a lot to Tahlequah area, where we were, of going to historic sites, working with many partners, and I'm doing a mapping Tahlequah history project as well, which is an interactive map. And this gathering is inspiring me too. It's a work in progress, but thanks to these kind of projects, I want to add railroads to this interactive map that we're doing. And so I just wanted to give you a sense that we're here today, but there are so many people who were a part of this journey, so many people who supported Jarren and Charlee and me, and all the work that we've been doing, that we went to the library and worked with Sophia Beverly, one of my favorite friends there, who developed a whole source library guide for railroads in Native America. And I know with this gathering, we're working with other libraries to do that, and going into archives and having a conversation of how do we use archives. They're not just sitting there, but how can you have, these experiences and really get to know archivists, that they're not these hidden behind the screen people, but people you can work with and collaborate with. And visiting historic sites also drew connections as well to railroads, that we'd go to a historic Thompson house, for example, which is Joseph Thompson's house at Cherokee Nation. And he had a big trunk, which he used for traveling on the railroad. Yeah. So this is how Jarren and Charlee, they came about all this research and work, and I wanted to share that. And then also, we had partners at not only these historic sites, but with Indigenous community members and leaders and intellectuals. Ernestine Berry of the John Hare Cultural Center and Museum, and a United Kituwa Band of Cherokee's elder, has worked closely with me and my students, giving of her time and being gracious and meeting with them and listening to the same presentations that you did, and providing feedback and insights of what she's experienced and gone through living and growing up in that part of Jalagi country. So that's something as well, of how do we build these community connections and ties, so that while we see dates, like this kind of timeline of 1866 treaties that Jarren and Charlee talked about, of all these different railroads and the transformation, and making these connections of how it's tied up in, as other speakers talked about, colonialism impacts everyday lives. I'm trying to be sure people have those lived, immersive, experiential learning experiences, and that there's also opportunity for service and reciprocity and relationships through all of them. So as I wrap up, unfortunately I can't get to everything I wanted to, because I want to be able to have a conversation more directly with you all, is that I'm really grateful for wherever I go, that I'm just trying to learn and understand where am I and what's happened there. And railroads is a part of so many of these spaces, but also inseparable as well from Indigenous homelands and indigeneity. And projects that I did at Northeastern State University, which was originally founded by the Cherokee Nation after the forced removal of the Trail of Tears as a Cherokee National Female Seminary. You see pictured here 2 women, Cherokee women, who were Cherokee citizens who, in their everyday activities, stood for Cherokee sovereignty and nationhood, that they rode the train, and it was a part of enabling them, mobilizing them, and a part of their learning journeys of being advocates for Cherokee sovereignty and dynamics. So I'll conclude there, and am very grateful for all these things I'm learning and continuing to learn. And I am really honored for all the people I've met here, and I really look forward to talking to you either in this big group that it can be awkward, big sea of people, or find you in the hallway or follow up in, an email or different ways of communicating. So please stay in touch, and I'm grateful for these connections. So how are we on time? We have time for Q&A? All right. Well, if anyone has any particular questions already, let me know. If it's the awkward silence, I have a little activity for you.
Well, we do have one question to start, if that's all right. This one comes virtually. So this is for Dr. King, but also Jarren and Charlee, if you have thoughts on it as well. It says, in spite of growing availability of resources online, is there a concern that students are losing the ability to dig into resources and critically analyze them due to Google culture? How do we combat that simplicity of search and read the top results in everyday conversations, especially since it's easier than ever to find material to confirm our biases?
Yes. Did any of you want to talk about that? That's kind of a research question of did you just get tempted to go to Google first and just, the research process of, was it hard for you to get beyond just Googling something, I think that's what that question gets at.
So yes, just using Google is very tempting. But I was fortunate enough where Dr. King showed me a couple of databases where there was a lot of information on the stuff I wanted to research.
Did you want to add anything, Charlie? Okay, that's pretty similar experience too. Yeah, and I think that was a big part of why I had all these different steps I was talking to you about, is saying, there are sources out there. It's just a matter of how do you learn to connect with them. And what I hear over and over again is there's not Indigenous sources. And that really frustrates me, because I'm like, yes, there are. They may not be written, but that's very limiting. Just because something was written does not mean that's it. That's the only way we can learn history, is if it was written, or that's the only truth. History is more valid when it's based off of written sources than oral sources. I don't care whatever people can, that's, I know, a can of worms and we can get into debates, but it really is a matter of epistemologies and respecting different people's ways of knowing. And then also that we need to get beyond, I think, a lot of the hard single, again, this is a very heavy mindset of you get ahead when you're the single author, when you're up there, up front, and you're getting all the credit. When I tell you, no one's doing their work alone. There are so many people who support them, but a little acknowledgements title is not always the best. And I think we also limit ourselves when we're always pushing the single individual and not working with community, which is such an Indigenous way of doing things as well. And it is hard and challenging for people who have all these different trainings that push in one way of learning, but we have a lot of work to do in indigenizing learning too. I think that question of sources also gets at that, because I try to also, that's why I try to bring in elders to my classes and help build positive relationships and reciprocity with service learning and opportunities to help students realize, we can do things in partnerships and in relationships that can open up more sources that are so important. And when I say sources, sometimes that's even just voices and understandings of the past. So I definitely have to put a shout out, like a point about that. Other questions? All right. Well, I told you if you have awkward silence,
Wait,
I have a little active.
But I have one.
Oh, you have one? Okay.
Well, first, a big thank you, Farina, for organizing this panel, and Jarren and Charlee for participating. I remember before I went to teach my first class. I was so nervous. I thought I didn't know what I was doing. And one of my mentors, Kent Blansett, told me, just remember, learning takes place on both sides of the podium. And I think this was a really powerful example of that, of two students as teachers here today. So thanks to both of you, because I think we've all learned a lot from what you shared. And now a question. A question I'd love to ask all of my partners in research and learning, which is, what surprised you the most digging into these topics?
Okay, I think what surprised me the most going into the research itself was, like I stated before, your public education. You learn that these railroads were amazing. You know, they transformed what is now our country and how fast they moved. And you almost looked at it as a good thing because that's how I learned it. And when you look at it from the other side, it's a little bit different. It tells a different story. And it surprised me. It kind of hurt. It hurt me to know, even though I didn't do it, that I used to think a certain way about the people who did. And that history is completely, you either get taught one side or the other. There's always three stories, like they say. There's yours, mine, and the truth. So you have side A, B, and then you have that middle ground. And it has been spoke on earlier today, we need to mesh those together, and we need to make it just one story that has the good and the bad and the ugly, so we can see how we have grown and where we need to grow in the future.
So I guess one of the most surprising things I learned is actually kind of personal, meaning that it's part of my family history that I knew but I didn't know. Because a lot of my research dealt with the Dawes Act, and there was actually a source I read. It was after I did the project, but I kept on kind of just looking at the research, where it mentioned my great-great-great-grandfather and how he opposed the Dawes Act, and the Dawes are in the railroads, and him and my grandmother were arrested and forced to sign the Dawes Rolls. So that was kind of one of the most surprising things I learned.
Thanks. I didn't even know that. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask people, I don't know if anyone had itching questions, but I really put up this slide up here because I wanted you all to have a minute to talk I have a teaching moment here. I'm putting on my teacher hat, and Jarren, you're going to be a teacher, so you can get this. But if you see it, if it's still up there, my questions were for you actually is before this, very similar to the process that Charlee just described, is before this, what we've had at this gathering, what you even heard just now. What did you think? What did you expect? What did you already know? But during this, what did you learn? What did you experience? And now, after this, what do you hope to do? What will you do? And I think that relates to these other two questions, which is how do you plan to apply what you learned today to teach others? Or, are you going to, what's the next steps for you? And how will you learn about railroads and impacts of Native America, moving after this, after this moment here with us. So if you don't mind taking a minute, I would love you to talk about that and hear some of the things, because that's a part of us hearing what did you gain from this moment, or what happened to you all out there at this time with us. So I'll give you about a minute. If you don't mind, talk to the person next to you, a buddy. They know I said that a lot in my classes anyway. Go ahead. I don't hear you talking. I'll walk around and eavesdrop. I'm gonna use, and you two can talk about that. Okay, so we're gonna ask people what kind of things came to mind to them. Anyone daring enough and willing to share, or do I do? Oh, okay, Robert. Yeah, thank you. You want to share?
The thing I thought before is that much of the Trail of Tears, because I'm from Georgia and we grew up learning a lot about it, I always thought that was enforced because of population. And then to realize that the railroad was brought in that pushed people out, and then the population came afterwards. So that surprised me of the railroad connection, because I always thought of it as the opposite of that. And so after this, I have to go back and rethink what I think about. The other thing that I thought about in all of this is that being out west and now thinking of the railroads first instead of second is how what we're studying in relationship with Buffalo soldiers and what were there as African American soldiers' relationship with those natives and the railroads.
And I'll tell you too, the other book I assigned in my class is Elena Roberts' book, I've Been Here All the While, which is about Cherokee freed people's experiences. So that's all entangled, a lot of dynamics there. So thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else want to share? What did you talk about? Danny, I'm going to call him Vic on you.
I think that I initially, was thinking about railroads, obviously all of the negative associations that come. Something I thought a lot about today was the relationship between the railroads and language, and how maybe the expansion of the railroad disrupted Indigenous languages and kind of what impacts that has had. But we talked a lot about, learning more about the ways that people use the railroad to move goods or to travel and visit people. And so looking at the ways that it was used for resistance or to connect communities across space. So. What do you think you're going to do next? That's a really, I'm gonna have to think about that one.
Yeah, but I think that's great to make that connection as well, right? I remember Larry earlier today said he ties it with assimilation. So language tied to that too, and those dynamics. Anyone else itching to share? Thoughts? No? I don't know how we are on time. Did you want to share anything? Yeah, okay. Then we're good on time? Huh? You shared plenty. Thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone taking a minute, even if you were on your island alone. I'm sure were absorbing everything and thinking about it. But my friend Summer Cherlee, she is in the Southwest Oral History Association with me. She shared that exercise with me, and I really enjoy that. So I hope you take that to heart, is, having that moment of reflection and thinking about before this, during it, and now what? Because with all these stories being shared with us, it's one thing to have it go in the ear and one ear out the other, but I hope it really helps us all in being better people and better relatives in all places and wherever we are. So thank you all, and thank you to Jarren and Charlee. Really hard job here, hard thing to do.